Hello, my name is Shen and welcome to the first in a series of videos explaining photography basics. So there are three main elements to creating a photograph that are ISO, shutter speed and aperture. Today we're going to run through them individually and see what they're about. These three factors work together to control the camera's sensitivity to the light around it. We're going to be talking more about digital photography rather than film photography. Although the two processes do differ, the theory remains the same. So let's start with ISO, which is the camera's sensitivity to light. ISO settings can range from 100 all the way up to 12,800 or even higher. The lower the number, the less sensitive the camera sensor will be to light, and therefore the photo will become darker. We won't pay too much attention to the numbers at the higher end of the scale. This is because at this end of the scale, the camera begins to produce unwanted noise or grain, which tends to make photographs unusable. Typically in low light, you can see some color distortions where a bit of green and pink might come into the photo, which doesn't look too good. The point at which your camera will start to produce this unwanted noise will also vary from device to device. Cameras with a smaller sensor size, such as on a smartphone, will start to produce this unwanted noise or grain at a much lower level rather than maybe a DSLR, where the rate can go a little bit higher into the higher thousands. It will take a bit of experimentation to see at which point your camera starts to do this. I would usually start with the ISO between 100 to maybe 400, depending on the light available. Once you've set your ISO as a starting point, you'll have two other factors to consider. Let's take a look at shutter speed next. In a traditional DSLR, as the name suggests, the shutter speed refers to how quickly the shutter will open and close in order to allow light through it. The shutter speed is measured in seconds. The quicker the shutter is open and closed, the less light will be allowed to pass through it, and therefore your image will be darker. And on the other side of the scale, the slower the shutter opens and closes, the more light will pass through it, and therefore your image will be a lot brighter. The shutter speed will vary depending on what type of photography you're going to do. If you're looking to do high action sports with a lot of movement, you're going to want a much faster shutter speed. Whereas if you're looking to do astrophotography or something that involves long exposure photography, you're going to want a much longer shutter speed that will allow the shutter to be open for much longer. The shutter speed at which you start will also depend on whether or not you are using a tripod. Typically there's a general rule of thumb that says your shutter speed shouldn't be slower than 1 over the focal length at which you're set. So for example, if you're using a 50mm lens, you're going to want to have a shutter speed of at least 1 over 50 seconds and nothing slower. Otherwise the shake from having it handheld will create a blurry photo or out of focus photo. The final part to controlling exposure is aperture. The aperture is how open the lens is and is measured in f-stops. This number can range from anything between f1.2, which is a wider, larger aperture, all the way down to maybe something like f22, which is a smaller, much narrower aperture. The smaller the number is, the wider the aperture is going to be, and therefore more light can pass through it. Therefore, the photo will become a lot brighter. Whereas with a narrower, smaller aperture, less light is going to be able to pass through it, and therefore you're going to have a much darker photo. Now we know the basics of exposure, we can experiment with each setting individually to cater to the type of photography we're going to do. These three settings work together and can be understood through this diagram called the exposure triangle. If you're taking photos of something with a lot of action and movement within the frame, you'd want to use a faster shutter speed in order to limit the amount of time the subject has when moving. In return, this would need to be balanced out with a wider aperture and potentially a higher ISO at the same time. On the other hand, if you're taking portraits of people, perhaps you'll want a wider aperture creating a shallow depth of field behind the subject. However, you want to be more careful with the focus because with a wider aperture there's more chance to get things a little bit out of focus. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you've been able to understand a little bit more about the basics of exposure. You can now go out and experiment on your DSLR and other cameras. If you like this video, please leave me a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos to do with photography. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.